what I thought we'd do is go around with introductions first, with each of you just saying what your water expertise is, what you've done recently or what bailiwick you have focused on in your career. And then I'll explain the agenda for the day and what we're going to be doing. And Ben is at the doctor's. He said he would show up in 15-20 minutes. So when he arrives, we'll just incorporate him and have him sit down. Right. And as you know from the emails you've been getting, my name is Karen Holweg. I think I know most of you except for John, who's a newcomer, and I'm delighted that you're here today. And want to ask each of you just to say your name and your area of expertise water-wise.
Thank you, Karen. My name is Mark Squilacci. I teach at the University of Colorado Law School. I teach our water resources law course. I also research and write in the water law area. And I served a 5-year term on the state or the city's Water Resources Control Board.
I'm Kurt Brown. I worked for the Bureau of Reclamation for 35 years, and towards the end of the term I was Director of Research and Development. My office did a lot of work with NOAA and NIST, the Corps, USGS on the effect of climate on water in the West. But having said that, I have to say that I'm 10 years past my expiration date because it's been that long since I did that work.
Hi, I'm Gordon McCurry, I'm a professional hydrologist. I was on the Water Resources Advisory Board of the city up until last year, so I served my 5-year term there. Did my PhD work looking at the effects of climate change on the water resources here in the Boulder Creek and South Boulder Creek Valley.
Hi, is that on? John Caron. I did my PhD here at the University of Colorado at a research center called CADSWES, and we worked with Reclamation and TVA in the development of some advanced modeling tools at the time, and I think they're still fairly advanced, but that work involved Colorado River modeling, and so one of my areas of expertise is on the Colorado River and Colorado Compact, and looking at the effects of climate change and uncertain hydrology on risk in that basin. I also, back in the day, worked with Liz at Hydrosphere, and I actually worked with Lee Rizaklis and others on some of the initial or updates to Boulder's drought response plan in the early 2000s following the 2002 drought. So have some broad knowledge and some local knowledge of Boulder's water issues.
Hi, I'm Liz Payton, and I have been on the planning board. I worked on the last comprehensive plan update, I guess. I think maybe there might have been one in between. Most recently, I worked for Western Water Assessment, a NOAA-supported applied research program at CU. It's housed at Ceres, and I just retired in December. But while I was at Western Water Assessment, I worked on a 500-page book or a doorstop called it was the state of the science, the climate and hydrology in the Colorado River Basin. I was a co-lead for that. And then most recently, I was the water chapter lead for the National Climate Assessment. So even though I started at Hydrosphere, I actually worked on the very original water supply model back in the 80s. I have transitioned to more of a climate change focus on water resources. But now I'm retired, so I'm mostly gardening.
And convincing with Plan-Boulder.
Yeah, I was co-chair of Plan-Boulder with Ray Bridge for a while.
Oh, great. And additional credential. Okay. Well, for today's agenda, we have basically three things we want to do. Kurt's going to start out with just a very short overview of the 2019 analysis, which was attached to one of the emails that I sent you, to sort of get us started thinking about the kinds of issues that you all know about. And then we want your thoughts and brainstorming and discussion on two questions. The first one is, what kind of assumptions, as we look to the next 20 years, should we, Plan Boulder, and the comp plan keep in mind? And the second question is, what suggestions do you have for Plan Boulder about the kinds of policies and recommendations we should get included in the new Boulder Valley Comp Plan? So, Kurt, why don't you get started and take it away? And
yeah. So I don't have to go into a lot of background here because I think all of you are aware of the 2019 report, and some of you may have contributed to it. And Gordon was on RAB when this was first presented. I think we're going to need to kill the lights. So the 2019 report looked at 7 climate scenarios varying on temperature and precipitation, and looked at how that would affect water supply and demand for the city of Boulder out 2050 and 2070. And my impression is that this, and to the extent that you can make it larger, Cindy, that would be great, that this is the most rigorous and comprehensive forecasting of Boulder's future water supply and demand that exists. We've heard some suggestion that maybe the city staff are updating this, but so far they have been unwilling to sit down with us and say what their plans are. So I think one of our tasks is to try to describe what sort of analyses we think, maybe building on this analysis, the city should do to forecast water supply and demand out 20, 30 years, which is the target of the comp plan. In a nutshell, and again, most of you are probably familiar with this report, it shows that under the more extreme climate scenarios of increased temperature and reduced precipitation, rather than having 100% of the years require no restrictions on water use, and that's that left column. You can see it says percent of years with no reductions is 100%. As you move towards the right in that chart, you start getting more and more years where we are triggering higher and higher levels of use restriction. One confusing thing is that shortly after this, the city switched from 4 levels of use reduction to, I think, 3. It's not quite clear. But anyway, that's the bottom line of this analysis. There are, I would say, 2 things that sort of jump out to me. And if we can go to that other PDF table, that would be great. If you can't, that's okay. Yeah, if you just toggle through what you've got open, I can tell you when it's the one we're looking for. Well, I can just describe it. One of the key aspects of this forecasting, of course, is to be forecasting what demand there will be and how that will change for the city of Boulder. This analysis, as far as I can tell, used the demographic projections from the 2015 comp plan update. And they project by 2040 7,000 additional residential units, and that drives the demand. So I think that's one area that we probably need to take a very close look at, because I think Cindy has tabulated a whole bunch of data about what likely increases there might be in basically water taps in the city. Another area of discussion is that while this analysis, I think, looks very carefully at the west slope water supply and therefore what might be provided to us under climate change, it doesn't attempt the Herculean task of guessing what would happen under the Colorado River negotiations. And I know John is ready to reveal what the solution will be on the Colorado River between the 7 states. So those are some of the main things. I mean, we can discuss whether climate modeling will be updated or needs to be updated. This was based on CMIT 5, and I guess there might be arguments to update it to CMIT 6, but that's way outside of my understanding. There are certain assumptions, I think, built into this about water conservation that probably will need to be made more explicit under the comp plan update. But I think that's a sketch of what we have from 2019, and then the question is, how should that be built upon or modified to address water supply and demand in the future, which obviously is a critical issue for the comp plan. Thank you, Karen.
Thanks. Why don't you just keep that microphone there and share that, and Mark and I'll share the one here. You probably saw attached to the invitation email that I sent you, the one-pager that shows, as Kurt referred to, Cindy's tabulation of all the housing units that are in the pipeline right now with the city. And this is where Plan-Boulder started by saying, well, so what is it that we're expecting? And we said, well, what is already in the pipeline? And those are these numbers, which show anywhere from a population of 145,000 residents to 164,000 residents, which is greater than the number in the city was using in 2015 for the last comp plan update. And then we said, but we don't have the water understanding and expertise to say, you know, whether the city has enough water or what could be said about water supply and demand in the comp plan revision, which is why we invited all of you here. And Cindy, if you can advance to the next slide, and I don't know whether you can get it to be full screen, but rather than the, okay, who's ready to begin? What kind of assumptions should we be looking at for 20 years, the Boulder Valley Comp Plan that is projected to look out 20 years from now?
Kurt, do you know what the offhand, what the number of what the population estimate was for the 2019 update?
I don't.
Well, you told me on the phone a day or two ago that the 2019 analysis used,
As far as I can tell, they used the 2015 projection of increased taps, and that was the 7,000.
Okay. Oh, right.
The question was, what was the demand based on for the 2019 report? And as far as I can tell, it cites to the 2015 demographic projections for the 2015 comp plan update, and that was projected to be 7,000 additional residences or water taps in the city.
does that answer your question, John?
Yes.
Okay.
And we're not able to put Cindy's paper up that shows all the possible.
No.
Okay.
I have a hard copy and I sent it to everybody. Anybody want to look at the hard copy?
That one thing you.
Yeah.
So one of the assumptions that would be important is projections of population in 20 years. I can think of several, and as a starting point, certainly projections of population listed, projections of water demand.
Per capita?
Sure, per capita. Projections of water availability or water supply. And I think the final one that comes to mind for me is controls the city will implement to limit water use. And so along those lines, maybe as a sub-bullet there, the city has a water efficiency plan, and they also have a drought plan. So those would be two items you could potentially list under that last line that they already have in place. A drought plan would be one of them, and a water efficiency plan. And Kurt was right when in his overview, the 2019 climate change study listed 4 levels of drought restrictions, and the current drought plan does have just three levels of restrictions. But nonetheless, those are key to water storage in our reservoirs, and also Colorado Big Thompson water, the deliveries.
Do you have a thought about, do you have a thought, or anyone have a thought about how or whether consideration of the Colorado River negotiation should be folded into this? Because certainly, I mean, it's pretty hard to guess what's going to happen, but certainly something will have happened in 20 years, 20 or 30 years during the period of the comp plan. And so the question of what scenarios we should incorporate is, I think, a big question.
Yeah, I can take a stab at that. I don't think it's going to affect it at all. We're not getting any more water from the west slope, as best I can tell. There's some exceptions to that, obviously. Gross Reservoir and the Windy Gap Firming Project, both are coming from the Colorado River. But I think we're done with diversions out of the west slope. And so I don't think Boulder would entertain new proposals that would increase that. So we're going to have to figure out our water supply situation within the Front Range, which I think we can do, which I don't think that's going to be a difficult issue for us. That's my understanding. I mean, there was a group headed by Jim Lockhead that made that commitment that we would not take any more water from the west slope. You know, those commitments can always be broken, and we'll have to see what happens. But I just don't think it would be wise for us to count on any additional water from the west slope. I don't see it happening.
Should we be counting on continuation of the northern deliveries that we have today?
Yes. I mean, we get a delivery that's based upon the amount of supply that's available, and that supply could go down. So there are, 310,000 shares of the CBT project. I don't know how many we have now, but we've got a substantial chunk of shares from that project, but we get an allocation that's based upon the supply that's available that year. So, you know, if that supply were to be compromised in some fashion because of drought or problems, we might get less. But my understanding is we generally don't use all of that water anyway from the CBT project. I mean, that could change, obviously, with increased demand, but I don't really think that's going to be a problem.
So no additional supply from the west slope could be less. The supply could be less.
I would say modestly less, but,
Yeah.
you know.
I mean,
Comma could be modestly less.
you know, the CBT project is junior to the compact. So in the extreme, under a compact call, the CBT water would be called out. there's a lot of minutia that you'd have to unpack within that statement, though, and that probably isn't worth getting into. Things like, was the water stored this year or in previous years before there was a call? There are other things like, CBT is a combination of municipal and industrial water as well as agricultural water. Certainly there are statutory, there's statutory language in water rights in Colorado that prioritize health and human safety over other uses such as agriculture. So there's a lot of what ifs and forks in the road, if you will, that you could go down there. But on the surface, CBT water is potentially curtailed under a compact call. Is that likely? And is it something we should worry about? I tend to agree with Mark that that's probably pretty unlikely. And even if it were to occur, I think that CBT would be in a position, Northern Water would be in a position where they would prioritize municipal use over other uses. And so,
do you agree with this statement, or should we have it?
Well, no, I think, I agree that there's not going to be additional water supplies from the West Slope. I don't think that's something you want to count on. But I also don't think that it's 100% certainty that the existing supplies will continue unmolested into the future, if you will. So, just to put a little finer point on that.
So after could be modestly less, I heard you say, but that's unlikely, but should we leave it the way it is?
I mean, I would put it in the same, I think that the project now typically, all over the last 20 years or so, has had about a 70% allotment on average. I think that's about what.
Yeah, that's
and
pretty
it's gone
standard.
down to as low as maybe 40%, I think, in some years.
In 2022, maybe it did, yeah.
Yeah, and I think again in like 2013,
Yeah,
it was
way
pretty
back.
low, like maybe 50%.
Yeah.
But those kinds of reductions are no greater than the variability we see within the Boulder Creek watershed anyway. So I mean, the one good thing from a resiliency perspective is that it is two different watersheds, and although they abut at the divide, they do actually have they can have significantly different snowpack and runoff hydrology. So that is a nice redundancy that we have in a sense. Anyway.
Well, I mean, this discussion sort of leads to for me, the sort of recommendation that the comp plan capture the uncertainty in the hydrology. Because, I mean, we don't know what's going to happen from an institutional standpoint, but we also really have a lot of uncertainty in what's going to happen from the hydrologic standpoint. So, like John was saying, what's the sort of joint probability of a drought on the west slope and a drought on the east slope at the same time? That's been fairly low so far, I guess, but we don't know what's going to happen to that in the future. So that's, I just think that would be a recommendation to make sure that the comp plan capture that, the range of uncertainty. Right.
Certainly, if we go into significant drought.
Do you want to?
One thing that seems to me might be correlated is a significant drought and a call on the river. So I think that's sort of the elephant that nobody knows how to deal with. And if we're making a recommendation to the city of Boulder for the comp plan, are we comfortable just assuming that Northern's deliveries are affected only by the precipitation, the hydrology? Or do we need to take into consideration in some way the fact that Colorado River supplies can't go up, but they could go down? Mark?
It sounds to me like we're on the next slide, which is specific recommendations for the comp plan. We don't need to write anything over. So
Can we not go there yet? Can we hold? Yeah, no, I just want to throw something out. Don't start writing yet because this could be controversial or there may be disagreement about it. But I do not believe, and I think there's evidence to support this, that increase in population translates in any significant way to an increase in water demand. And I say that largely from what we've seen with the projections regarding the gross reservoir expansion. And I've got some charts I'm happy to share with folks, but when that project was first proposed by Denver Water, it was largely based upon their projections of increased population. And while it took a long time, of course, for them to finally get approval, they're now still in litigation. It's being held up right now. But Denver Water did its own analysis subsequently and determined that even as their population has grown dramatically over the past 20 or 30 years, their water demand has actually declined. And per cap, total water has declined. And so I think we just really need to be careful here, because this is sort of feeling like a bit of an assumption that when you have increased population, you're necessarily going to have increased demand. Now, I'm not saying that's never true, and I'm not suggesting that it's not something we need to pay attention, that is automatically translating into increased demand. At least in the case of Denver, that doesn't appear to be true. Again, I've got charts I'm happy to share with people, but it was dramatic in terms of the increase in population and actual decline of water demand. And part of that just has to do with infrastructure and the way that people are replacing all their faucets and washing machines and things that use water, and they're using less because of federally mandated standards on all those kinds of things. So that is a big help. And the other thing, of course, is that it doesn't build in the kind of potential conservation measures that cities could adopt, and that's obviously something we need to pay attention to as well. I should just acknowledge that I've been an opponent of the gross reservoir expansion, so full disclosure here, but part of the reason I oppose that now more than $500 million project is because there's this assumption sometimes that you can build your way out of a problem like water supply or demand, and maybe, we tried that with highways and lots of other things, and it doesn't seem to help us. And so I'm all for sort of studying these issues and having these important discussions and debates about issues, but I just want us to be, from my perspective at least, we need to be very careful about making assumptions about where demand is going based upon increases in population, because I don't think that there's certainly not a one-to-one correlation, but there may even be a negative correlation depending on the data that we have. And so we just need to be really careful about that. Liz mentioned a moment ago about you have to look at the types of housing that's going up. A lot of the new housing in Boulder, of course, is multifamily housing. You don't see yards. It's probably going to be xeriscaped in some way. There will be water demand. I'm not saying that they're not going to use any water, but those are all sort of complicating factors as we think about water demand. And I think Boulder's done a decent job of conservation. I don't think we've done as much as we could do, certainly not with outdoor water conservation. And so I'm optimistic that with our existing supply, short of something happening with Northern, I still don't think that's likely, and I know we currently don't even use all that water, but I think we're in reasonably good shape, and that we in Boulder, personal opinion now, need to learn to live with what we have and not expect we're going to get more resources to do it. Anytime we go for more water, it affects everybody else around us who might need more water, and frankly, a lot of communities around us need the water a lot more than we do. So I'm very sort of wary of Boulder saying it's time for us to go out and seek more water rights. So sorry for the little speech there.
Or the other choice besides seeking more water rights is to limit growth, right?
Maybe.
Less water taps.
Growth isn't actually increasing demand.
Yeah, okay. John?
Well, I agree with Mark on a lot of those points, and I think one of the interesting things that's happened, I think in large part sort of 2002 was a tipping point or a change of philosophy in many ways, but one of the interesting things that is starting to happen is that the incremental savings, and it's very true. I mean, the Front Range has grown enormously, and yet exports from the Colorado Basin to the Front Range have stayed basically the same, and in spite of roughly 50% increase in population. So there is this there has been thus far anyway a reduction in per capita use that's been commensurate with the increase in actual population. Moving forward, I think we can assume that that per capita use will continue to decline, with a bit of a caveat, and that is that this concept of water demand hardening, and every additional gallon per capita per day that you want to conserve costs more and more. In other words, you know, we can put in low flow shower heads, we can put in low flow toilets, we can you know, have high efficiency sprinklers or do xeriscape or, you know, do all these things, but at some point there's some level of a floor, and getting below that floor is impossible or very, very expensive. And so you'll start to run into situations where, well, we could maybe conserve more water, but it's going to cost, you know, continue to cost a lot more to do that. And so I do think at some point there's a floor to that notion of reducing per capita use. I don't know when that is. I don't know if it's in 20 years or 40 years or 60 years, but it's just something to kind of keep in mind, is that you can't conserve indefinitely, right? You can't continue to reduce use indefinitely. So
Just a quick question about that. Also, to follow on what you're saying, I think you lose the buffer of outdoor irrigation, and so there becomes a much tighter linkage between supply and use restrictions, which should probably be taken into account as Boulder looks out 20, 30 years.
So before we go any further, let me see if we can get two things I think I've heard up here, unless you're going to go ahead.
I'd
Go
just
ahead.
like to sort of close this thought, also agreeing with Mark about the reduction in use, and that the increase in population doesn't necessarily correlate with an increase in water usage. And you had mentioned Denver Water's information. The Boulder's Water Efficiency Plan, which just came out this past January 24, so a year ago, it's one of their newest plans, has a really great table, which of course is illegible right here, but it's total water use between 2020 and 2022, or 2000 and 2022, so a 22-year annual plot dividing outdoor water use compared to indoor water use and total water use. And just as you were suggesting, Mark, water use has declined through that time by about 20%. And it's been, total water use has been relatively flat since about 2010. Slight decline since 2010, but dramatic declines after the 2000 to 2003 drought. And yet population has continued to grow since 2010. So again, to your point, John, the per capita use has declined also then as population has increased over the last 15 years or so. Nonetheless, I think we're a much more sophisticated audience in this room than those developing the comp plan, and certainly the public reading the comp plan. So it might not hurt to suggest this association between population and water use, even though perhaps the facts don't bear it out. But just to get people thinking, oh, the more people we have, the more water will be used.
Do you want to grab a sandwich and something to drink and have a seat? Welcome. I want to make sure that we also get John's point under this, which is, I've lost it. That at some point you get to the point where this may no longer be true. You've reduced usage. Say it the way you concisely said it.
Well, there's a floor at some point in terms of.
there's a floor, maybe not a hard floor, but it becomes a lot more difficult to continue to decrease per capita use. and it
Okay.
becomes more expensive to decrease per capita use.
Okay.
And so there's sort of a flattening. That curve, back in 2002 when that drought happened, there was, for lack of a more elegant way to put it, there was a lot of slop in the system. And it was fairly easy to reduce use. And there were a number of things we could do to reduce that use. Over time, we've become much more efficient and intelligent about those things. And so the number of remaining levers grows ever smaller in terms of our ability to reduce that per capita use. And so eventually we're going to run out of those levers, or they're going to become, prohibitively expensive levers. So.
Okay, add the cost element, or may become prohibitively expensive.
Perhaps.
I agree with what John was saying here. I mean, obviously there is this concept of demand hardening. I would only say that as the cost goes up to conserve, the cost goes up to provide additional water as well, in some ways much higher than the cost of conservation. So, I don't think this is just a friendly amendment to what you were saying, John. I think, we really do need to think about sort of those two issues in tandem. And I don't think we're at the point where we've seen all the conservation that we can do. I think there's probably a lot more that could be done. We just don't know. We talked about uncertainty. It's pretty uncertain how far we can go with conservation, how effective it'll be. But we do need to also keep in mind that other point, that as time goes on, it's going to get a lot more expensive to acquire additional kind of water rights. So.
And may I ask a specific question on the second to last one? For Gordon's point, you say that the increased population may or may not correlate to increased water usage? Or just leave it the way it is?
I think what you got doesn't necessarily.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
It's fine.
And the last one, everybody's okay with?
I would like to comment on that a little bit. I mean, I don't know what prohibitively expensive means when it comes to water, because you look at Vegas, they actually have people patrolling. I mean, they have a core of folks who are paid, to patrol the streets to see who's irrigating. Yeah, and they have all kinds of other measures implemented. And then there are, like Aurora and other communities are doing water reuse. That's incredibly expensive, pumping it into the ground. So I don't know what prohibitively expensive means. I think there are so many places that we haven't gone, or the city hasn't gone yet. And I'm recommending that there's a patrol to go around and ticket people who are watering or whatever, but.
Does it need to say increasingly expensive instead of prohibitive?
Yeah, maybe that's,
I would say,
yeah.
that's fair.
Just change prohibitively to increasingly.
Gordon, you were most recently on the water board. Have we made progress on remote monitoring of water, domestic water supplies?
It's been a minimal change. No,
Not much.
nothing appreciable.
Okay.
Do we have a third microphone?
No.
No, there's not been considerable change in remote monitoring, nor has there been much improvement in monitoring precipitation for flood protection.
I mean, that seems like an obvious thing. It's obviously a long-term and expensive kind of investment to put that in, but it would, over time, it would likely save a fair amount of money for the city to be able to do that. John has a comment.
I had another question for you, Gordon. I seem to recall 15 or plus years ago, when I was actually doing a bit of work for the city, that one of the biggest potential places to conserve or eliminate loss was actually in the distribution system. And I don't know if that's been pursued further, but I remember some pretty dramatic numbers in terms of like 20 to 25% of the treated water is actually lost to seepage and leakage from the delivery system. And so I'm just curious if that has if that has been pursued at all.
Yes, that's an excellent question, John. The city has become painfully aware of its aging infrastructure, and over the last 10 years has devoted quite a bit of the Water Supply Enterprise Fund, which is one of the components of our water bills, into replacing both the water and wastewater pipeline systems. So currently, the average loss is about 10%, which they feel for a municipality is reasonable. It's consistent with most major municipalities. And going forward in both the drought plan and the water efficiency plan in particular, they target having the water loss no worse than 10%, and are trying to achieve a goal of a 6% loss, which I don't know if that's feasible or not.
I don't think we've gotten Mark's last suggestion up here yet, and I don't hear anything, so you want to repeat it so the city can get it.
I'm not sure what suggestion about maybe that there are, well, I guess one of the comments that I made was that we need to, when we're thinking about the cost of conservation, we need to also think about the parallel costs of increasing water supply. And even if the cost of conservation is high, the cost of increasing our water supply may be even higher. So those two are really important to consider in tandem, I guess. Maybe that's a way to put it.
There's a need to consider both.
Conservation, the cost of
The cost of-
conservation
The cost of conservation versus
versus the cost of increasing supply.
Okay?
Can we circle back and give that a chance to
Yeah.
catch up? So where we started. So where we started is with the 2019 report, because it seemed to me the most rigorous and current analysis. And as you know very well, under certain climate assumptions, climate change assumptions of temperature and precipitation, you start triggering use restrictions more and more, whereas today we project really never having to do use restriction. And so the question generally to the group is, how should we be building on that analysis? What scenarios should the city be looking at for the 20 or 30-year outlook for the comp plan when it comes to water supply and water demand? And I'm sure you have thoughts about that, so I'm going to hand you the mic.
All you're going to get is kind of a disclaimer, because as I explained to Karen when she called, this is a little awkward because I'm currently working on doing a little bit of work for Boulder through Linker. And so I really can't comment on that. And I will.
Ben, for your information, we've had other people say similar things, so you're not
I'm not the only
alone,
one.
totally alone.
I'll just say, there's incredible uncertainties about virtually everything, except, Boulder will probably get bigger. That's fairly certain. But, of course, there's real uncertainties in terms of the future climate and then the hydrologic effects of that, both on water use and water supply. And similarly, there's, for Colorado, the Boulder's Colorado River supply, there's a whole another layer of uncertainty, which is the institutional stuff over there, which is totally up in the air right this moment. So
if you were advising the city about a 30-year outlook, would you tell them don't even worry about Colorado River negotiations?
Well, not at this moment. There's nothing you can worry about because you don't know what it's going to be.
From a risk management standpoint, I guess.
Well, if you have to make a decision right this minute, then, I don't know. I mean, my best guess would be that we're going to fall back to the long-range operating criteria, at least for a while, because they won't reach an agreement. But so you could do your analyses based on that. So that's, I would say, if you have to make a decision right now, If not, I'd wait and see.
Yeah, I mean, we don't have to make a decision right now, but we're trying to project what the future might hold so that we can show the public various scenarios of growth, density, whatever, and so that they can acquire some assumptions about the future.
Yeah, I agree. But in the Colorado River, it's going to be really hard to know. I mean, I guess you could estimate a range of things from worst case to best case on both climate and institutions. And that's a bit of work. But you could do that or find a range or even potentially develop a few estimates of likelihood. So, but it would be a fair amount of work to do that.
More work for you.
I was just going to say, can,
More work for you.
is,
Well, can we capture that in some way?
Liz, are you going to comment on that?
I was just going to say one of the items that maybe we can eliminate in terms of uncertainty is by the end of this year, there should be an agreement for the post-2026.
Or not.
Or not? Not the end of this year? No, the end of next year?
There's
I'd say,
no guarantee.
I'd say there's a high likelihood that we revert to the LROC has been suggested. I would say there's a 50-50 chance that's where we end up. Yeah.
I don't see this administration waiting in. We have a commissioner. Assistant Secretary, one time.
So
Okay,
what?
So the point that Kurt doesn't want to lose is
Well, I would turn to Ben and say, how would you describe what you talked about in terms of the range of outcomes or worst case and best case? And here's your mic, by the way. Sorry.
I think the city should consider a broad range of possible futures with respect to climate and Colorado River water supply. So let me just comment on that. To say more than that, you really have to dig deep, and there's a lot of nuance and complication. And, that's a pretty sort of almost self-obvious comment, but that's what we got to do. It's how you do that is a project.
That
Just to clarify, you're talking about both the climatic hydrologic uncertainty, but you're also folding in institutional uncertainty related to the Colorado River.
Right. And there's probably a little bit of that on the Platte side too, because there's going to be a dispute over what is your allowable consumptive use for a piece of agricultural land as ET goes up.
Right.
And I don't know. We've never made a model of the Supreme Court, the Colorado Supreme Court or U.S. Supreme Court. So, not that I'm aware of. Nobody's done that.
what's going to happen to all those water rights that don't kick in until April 1 or right when they want to irrigate in the middle of March or early March or late February, because water rights have specific decreed start dates. I mean, there's all sorts of weird things like that.
We've already seen the effects that we simulated back in 2010 or whatever it was on the water availability study happened up in Washington, where the senior direct flow rights were, and this is not related to getting drier, with the same water, essentially precipitation water supply on, I think, the Snoqualmie Pass, they ended up with much warmer temperatures, several degrees warmer, and the water came early. So the relatively junior water users that had reservoirs, the municipal water users were fine because it didn't matter when their water came down. But the orchardists that were using direct flow water ended up having to tear out their orchards because the later season flows were really low. So we can, that's something that will happen almost with a high degree of certainty because it totally relates to just increasing temperatures.
So, this kind of circles back to a broader concept that I want to throw out, and for myself, who spends a lot of my clients' money developing climate change hydrology scenarios and looking at what could happen in a drought and all those things. This may be a little contrarian to that, but we have plenty of information out there about what a future might look like, and we have plenty of what-if scenarios in terms of hydrology. And we can create hydrologies that'll crash any system, anywhere, anytime. And hydrology is something we really can't control, right? We really don't have control over that. What we can control is demand, and how we operate our system. And so, I think it's worth keeping in mind there are things we can control and things we can't control. And to some extent, a lot of the work that we have done lately has moved a little bit away from trying to understand what the climate might do, because we have plenty of hydrologic traces that can crash the system, and instead really focus on, if these bad things happen, what should we be doing, and what are the implications of doing those things? So, what does it look like to have a 10 years in a row of stage 3 drought reductions? What are the things that get hurt under that scenario? What are the things that we can do to mitigate against those bad things happening if we have, very prolonged drought, water restrictions? So, not trying to completely change the conversation away from climate, which is obviously critically important, but I think we know enough to know that we're never going to predict exactly what's going to happen 5 years from now, and we can come up with all sorts of different what-if scenarios. But really, the more important question, I think, is having the flexibility to react in the face of uncertainty when those things come about. If we're in stage 2 drought this year, what happens if the reservoirs fill next year, or what happens if they are empty next year, right? And so those sort of what-if scenarios where we assume certain things might happen and play out those sort of games, if you will, I think are a lot more important from an operations and a planning perspective than trying to, understand the uncertainty around climate.
So to concisely consider that as one of your recommendations for the comp plan, you would say?
Adaptive management. That's really what we're talking about is the ability to react to quickly changing hydrologic conditions. And what are the things you need to do that? To rapidly changing water supply conditions, which is really another way of saying rapidly changing climate conditions.
So water supply / climate conditions.
So, yeah, that makes a lot of sense, obviously, and it's a great concept. I think when it comes down to the decision makers looking at their budget and where to invest, what infrastructure to invest in, they're going to be asking for probabilities. What is the probability of this happening because I'm going to spend this much money? And so, you still have to have some kind of hierarchy of risk or something, to even implement an adaptive management plan, some kind of sense of what's most likely and what's less likely and that kind of thing. So, anyway.
To follow up from what John had as this adaptive management statement, the phrase that came to mind to me, which I think is very popular in the city of Boulder, is it would be appropriate to advocate a precautionary principle. The precautionary principle on water use.
Can I make a slight, just a question or a comment about the precautionary principle, which I generally support in the area of environmental law. What I worry about in the context of water is that sometimes precaution, I used to hear this a lot on RAB, that, they need resiliency and redundancy in everything they do. Precautions are good. My sense is that often it leads to overbuilding, and there are significant implications in terms of cost and environmental consequences when you overbuild. Overbuilding infrastructure, yes. And so I don't disagree with the idea of exercising precaution, but I worry about how that's sometimes interpreted, and it's used as a justification sometimes to overbuild. And so I would just be careful about it.
And that's why I put on water use, not on water availability.
Okay, yeah.
And
go ahead.
I think Liz's point is relevant here because you can look at these potential problems and apply the information you have about likelihood. You shouldn't overbuild, right? Ideally. So it's helpful to do that. And I think maybe there hasn't been as much of that as there should have been.
Can I make a...
Go ahead.
Before we go on, hold that thought, Mark.
Okay.
Do we need to get Liz's point out here?
Well, I think that's under the broad range, and I was going to add at the end of that, consider probabilities or likelihoods. And I think maybe you just say, considering likelihoods. It just gets really complicated, and there's all sorts of scientific dispute, and, backbiting and about this. So that's why I tried to keep it as tight and simple as possible, because you end up talking about this or writing about it for weeks, months, years when you get into it.
Yeah, I mean, what's the likelihood that all 20 some odd projects are going to be built?
Right.
Right? What's the range of potential future new housing?
So
Well, I think that's the key question for the comp plan, is to array a reasonable range of futures and look at how they affect different qualities of life or sustainability. I think your point about adaptive management is really good. The city, looking at that list, they have some discretionary decisions about how much they're willing to reduce their adaptive flexibility. And it can be reduced a lot if they build all of those things, or less if they decide not to build that much additional demand into the system.
can I?
Yeah,
Oh, go ahead.
A couple of follow-ups on this. From earlier when Liz was mentioning about the difficulty in implementing some of the water demand restrictions, I'd like to share with the group that the latest city drought management plan, which came out in November of 2022, has a table. It's a lengthy document, but a summary table which lists about 15 or so different specific responses that can be implemented both for indoor and outdoor water use reductions under each of the 3 stages of the proposed drought management. And so I think there's already a good framework in place. Perhaps one thing that Plan-Boulder could advocate is that a few of the key city documents, a few of the key city plans should get more public attention. And I think the drought plan is one of them, and the water efficiency plan is one of them.
So both the drought plan and the water efficiency plan
Yeah,
should
should receive more public attention. And responding back to the advocated precautionary principle on water use. An example is, again, from the drought plan, each of the 3 stages of drought restrictions are based on a projected storage index, and that's a very simple equation. Well, that equation could be tweaked to become more conservative. In other words, to trigger the implementation of the drought things. Maybe or maybe not. I'll just throw it out there as an example of how the precautionary principle could be used. For example, right now it's just 2 variables. It's the maximum mountain storage divided by the average demand. And so the maximum projected storage, that's a fairly liberal definition they've got. They could make that a little bit more conservative, as an example.
And these are factors
In the drought plan.
in the drought plan.
I don't know, that's something we need to memorialize on these bullets, but just for clarification for this group, that the city has put a lot of thought into these plans, and they typically don't see the light of day before they embark upon another plan.
Can I?
Making them more conservative is an additional point, right?
Well, that would be the precautionary principle on water use.
What should I say after that?
I think you should add on to the end of that, e.g., implementing the drought plan. You could add on to that, implementing the drought plan earlier, or lowering the thresholds for implementing the drought plan. Because as I recall, stage 1 is sort of a public education level, I think, in the current drought plan. Before you start restricting use, you take a lot of steps to educate the public about water use and the condition of the supply, and et cetera.
Since
Mark?
Yes. So since we have all these smart people in the room, I'm going to throw out an idea that I've been wrestling with for a while. And it has to do with kind of my experience on RAB suggested to me that we and virtually every water utility on the Front Range are very parochial in the way we look at things. I mean, this whole discussion this afternoon, has been only about Boulder. And we can't lose sight of the fact that everything we do in terms of our water supply affects everybody else who might need water on the Front Range. And so we really just need to be thinking more broadly about not just the consequences for us and our residents, but the consequences for everybody who lives in this region. And one of the things that this has led me to think about is the possibility, this is long-term, this is not tomorrow or next year, the possibility of regional water management. I understood. I mean, which is why I say this is long-term. But it's kind of crazy. I mean, you think one example, I think, that illustrates the problem is that, I guess, 5, 6, maybe 10 years ago now, we built that pipeline from Carter Lake down to the treatment plant down on 75th Street. And cost us, I think, $45 million. We saved a lot of water through seepage. Northern took it all back, everything we saved. We didn't get an ounce of that water that was saved from that project. We paid for the whole thing. Northern owns it. There are a lot of things about that whole thing that disturbed me in some ways. But beyond that, the pipeline goes fairly close to the city of Longmont, which right at the same time was spending $70 million to buy into the Windy Gap firming project. And I asked the RAB and the utility people, why are we talking to Longmont about maybe sharing the cost of this and maybe working with them on water supply and figuring out whether we could come up with a partnership? $70 million, they were getting, I think, 10,000 acre-feet of water, nothing to sneeze at, but Windy Gap firming project is not exactly an obvious kind of solution. I mean, there could still be problems with that project. But the answer basically is we don't do those kinds of things. We just don't talk to each other. And Boulder, people don't like Boulder because we're Boulder and we really can't do that kind of thing. And I just find this so troubling that we can't figure out a way to communicate about a shared responsibility and shared need that we all have. And I realize this is a little bit beyond what we're talking about here, but I just think it's so interesting to think that we don't talk in terms of regional water management, even though I think that there's something to be gained there. I don't know. Sorry to sort of disrupt the thread here, but
How about if we consider regional water?
long-term, yeah, that would help because cooperative, good, yeah. That would be very politically problematic.
Sounds voluntary.
There you go, okay. Right.
Well, yeah, I mean, John knows this better than anybody probably, but they have the river district on the west slope where they can kind of coordinate efforts, and there is sort of an overarching entity that's keeping track, right? Sort of. I
Yes,
mean,
but-
they can optimize to some extent.
But it's not so much, I mean, you know, here we're talking about, and really I think probably the best example is the South Metro group, right? I mean, that there's a number of small water providers who essentially, jar my memory here, Ben, back in the early 2000s. I don't know. I mean, but a number of water providers on the south side of Denver got together and collaboratively built pipelines and developed a system that would increase the overall redundancy across these multiple agencies, essentially. And you know, so there are some examples of that out there.
There are plenty around the country.
It's a great idea.
One of the things that's noted in the 2019 report is sort of an addendum. I'm sorry. One of the things the 2019 report says is because of the potential for having reduced supply, is that Boulder should investigate to a greater extent our reuse rights. Now that starts affecting other entities, and so does anyone have a view about, I mean, they sort of view it as additional supply, but in a way it's, they're just taking more out of the system. You guys know a lot more about this than I do.
Who wants to talk? I mean, it was on my exam that I just gave, so I'm thinking about, so I've been thinking about reuse a little bit. It's expensive, obviously, and I mean, in our situation in particular, there are communities downstream. I mean, just as a good neighbor, I would think it would be problematic for us to do that. I'm not saying that that's always a bad idea. I think there are situations where recapture and reuse might make some sense. I mean, certainly if you're on the coast and the water, your wastewater is going into the ocean or in some unusable saline body, might make some sense to do something like that. I don't see that as a solution for Boulder necessarily, but I don't know.
Well, there are reuse methods that don't involve wastewater. So, you know, Boulder, and I think Boulder already does this in a small way, stores water below the wastewater treatment plant in a reservoir and then uses it for exchanges later on. And that doesn't require any, it's really, other than owning space in the reservoir, it's not super expensive. Doesn't require any of the yuck factor.
Okay, in our last 5 minutes or so, I want you to look at the heading up here about suggestions for the comp plan that Plan-Boulder should include as we're working.
Both indoor and outdoor.
You're talking distribution systems.
And consumption, right?
Even things like allowable lawn sizes, like Aurora tried.
Anything else you can think of?
Sorry, I was going to ask Gordon a question, just, or anyone else who's familiar with what the city has done. I mean, has there been an analysis of the economics of a variety of different you know, what are the economics of relining all of the treated water delivery pipes versus the economics of brown water or dual water systems for new residential development versus retrofitting residences versus, so I guess maybe that's, the broader topic there is just the economics or prioritization of cost and resulting yield from different efficiency measures. Is that something that's been done or has been looked at in any sort of comprehensive
That's
way?
going back to the point that Liz made earlier, right?
The city has been, they've developed prioritization systems to look at the infrastructure, mostly the delivery infrastructure, so the pipeline infrastructure, and in terms of replacement timing, replacement costs versus, say, rehabilitation timing and costs, but haven't taken it that next step that you were suggesting. The most forward-thinking item the city has done fairly recently is what they call the Comprehensive Flood and Stormwater Master Plan, and yes, which Liz worked on, and that again prioritized what and where and how those systems should be implemented. But in terms of a supply and demand, no, not really.
So the idea that I don't want to forget here is that we should prioritize the costs of, and then I want you guys to fill in the blanks.
I guess maybe not prioritize so much as just understand the costs relative to the yields of any ongoing infrastructure efficiency improvements, et cetera, et cetera. I just think certainly that's going to be important from a public-facing perspective, is understanding what these things are costing.
Improvements?
Yeah. Ongoing, yeah.
Efficiency improvements. Yes?
Yes, sure. Yeah, infrastructure efficiency improvements, sure, that works.
It gets the point across.
Karen,
Yep.
see you're seeing all this stuff and not useful.
Do you all want to have another cut at this? Do you want to see a copy and with the possibility of sending feedback or not? Yes or no?
Up to you.
Okay. If we
How
send
about
it,
if you have questions, you can
okay,
reach out.
okay, great. Well, I really appreciate all your thinking and discussion. I think facilitating group, and I think you've come up with some wonderful ideas. And I really appreciate your tapping all of your expertise and knowledge for our sake. Gordon?
Yeah, just a closing thought on that summary you put together, Boulder proposed housing units, housing projects.
Yep.
The population, the proposed new developments, the population number there is almost identical to the projected 2040 population that's included already in the Boulder Water Efficiency Plan. So when I first looked at the listing of all the new developments, I thought, holy cow, well, the city had already incorporated
Mark.
that into their water efficiency plan.
I thought there were more on the list that we had.
There were other categories that were more, and the next category up was about 8% more than in the water efficiency plan, 8% more houses. The highest one, which I think included Area 3 development, ends up being about 12% more units than, or population than in the water efficiency plan. So they're not dramatic as just the compilation by
more.
itself.
Yeah.
They are more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good. Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Ben, thank you for coming.
Oh,
I appreciate
glad I could,
your
yeah.
thoughts. I know you're sort of caught betwixt and between here, but
Yeah.
you know as much as anybody about all these issues.
Well, the stuff I'm focused on, John knows an awful lot about too, so.
Yeah.
You're kidding.
I saw him here, I thought, why did she ask me to come? Because John's done a huge amount of work on the Colorado River.
Yeah. Well, I think because you were a main author on the 2019 report, we were starting.